Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashem, Yahushai, Bashem, Rakabadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. And listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's topic, I wanted to read through Nehemiah, the 6th chapter. Um, and basically, this chapter is very interesting because it basically goes into some of the plots, the schemes, the wicked devices of what the heathen were doing during the time of Nehemiah. Where basically they were helping to rebuild those different those walls of Jerusalem, right? So this is the basically the rebuilding process. And in earlier chapters, Nehemiah was basically suffering from ridicule. So the heathens were round about, and they were basically mocking us and telling us, what do they think they're doing, and so on and so forth, right? Just to show you a little bit of history of what was going on in that time, right? So, I guess I'll start off with this precept actually, just to get an understanding of what is actually being done here. Let me go to Second Kings, because I mentioned the walls, right? So it says, this is Second Kings 25. I'll read from verse 8 to 10 just to get an idea of what is actually being done here. This is it says Jerusalem burned and plundered, and it says in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which is in the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. And it says, and he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house he burnt with fire. And the army, and all the army of the Chaldees that were with the captain of the guard break down the walls of Jerusalem round about. And now the rest of the people that were left in the city and fugitives fell away to the king of Babylon, and the remnant, a multitude, did Nabuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. So this is basically the destruction of the temple that was basically built by King Solomon, right? So the Babylonians came in, they destroyed it, and basically we got carried into Jerusalem and we went into captivity, right? So this is something also is also spoken of in Jeremiah, I believe the 39th chapter as well. So this is what's, these walls that were broken down, these were what is actually being rebuilt when you fast forward into Nehemiah's time, right? So Nehemiah basically he served as a cupbearer to the king, right? I believe it was King Artaxerxes, right? And he had permission from the king to basically to rebuild those walls, right? And the king was able to, because Nehemiah had that favor, he was a cupbearer, right? Somebody who was very, very trustworthy. He was able to go and actually rebuild, and actually access resources, because we were pretty much in a state where, I don't want to say we were destitute or no, but Nehemiah just had that favor from the Lord, right? The scriptures talk about how, when a man's ways please the Lord, he make his enemies to be at peace with him, right? So Nehemiah had that, peaceable, um basically, how you call it in the world, you would say today, like social capital. You had that social status, with the king, you had that favor, right? um but nevertheless, let me jump to the the point here, and this is very interesting, I thought, in this chapter, and I'll read it in the AMP. It's in Nehemiah 6:1, and it says, and now Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and that there was no breach left in it. although at the time I had not set up I had not set up doors in the gates. And Sanballat and Jerusalem sent word unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together in Cherephirim, in the plain of Ono. But they were planning to harm me. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. So why would I stop work? Why would the work stop while I leave to come down to meet with you, right? So this is just going into several of the different plots that were actually done by the heathen. They wanted to meet with him. You know what I'm saying? So this is, and these are people, the scriptures talk about never to basically trust your enemies, right? Back then we actually had an understanding of, we didn't want to be a reproach unto the heathen. And we actually understanding of who we are. When you look at our people today, they're too trusting towards basically their enemies, right? Because they have forgotten the nature of what their enemies are actually capable of, right? When you go into Psalms 83, you get a list of all of our different enemies, right? Starting with Esau, Edom, right? Our people have become very, very too simple, and then they're surprised when the snake bites them. You know what I'm saying? And the scriptures say that as well. Who shall pity a charmer who's bitten by a serpent, right? So this is what happens. When you let your guard down around a serpent, it's just in your nature to actually bite you, right? Um, Here it says, verse 4. Then they sent word to me 4 times in this way. I answered them in this way, and then Sanballat sent his servant to me in the same way the 5th time with an open letter in my hand. And it is written, it is reported among the neighboring nations, and Gashmu is saying that you and the Jews are planning to revolt. And that is the reason you are rebuilding the wall. According to these reports, you are to be their king, right? So this is going on to, this is, further seeing the different plots of what the enemy is actually doing during this time of their rebuilding process. And this is all, even though I'm reading the physical rebuilding process, understand and taking the spiritual aspect of what's actually going on here. When you see certain events playing out, with our people today, when you see people like, for example, Vocab Malone, the way he's reacting to us actually basically dwelling together in unity, being those lively stones, you know what I'm saying? When you see those things, don't be alarmed that, he is reacting this way, because he's behaving as an adversary, just like we had adversaries back here in this time in regards to that rebuilding process. Okay, so this is verse 7. Um, so this is continuing on of what they wrote, and it says, also, it is reported that you have appointed prophets to make a proclamation concerning you in Jerusalem, saying this there is a king in Judah. Now these things it will be reported to the Persian king, right? Because we're still basically in captivity, but we had permission to be able to go back and, so on and so forth, right? Um, so come on now and let us consult together. And I sent a message, this is Nehemiah speaking, saying, such things as you are saying have not been done. You are inventing them in your own mind, right? So basically, they came up with these ideas, and they're trying to concoct stories about how when they see us rebuilding those walls of Jerusalem, right? They're trying to make up things. They're trying to make up stories. Okay, you're trying to overthrow the Persian king. So basically, they're making it seem like they're causing basically a threat, like a physical threat. You know what I'm saying? Um, this is verse 8, and it says, I'm sorry, verse 9, and it says, for all they wanted to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work and it will not be done. But now, O Yahweh, power, Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, strengthen my hands. When I went into the house of Shemaiah the son of Deliah, the son of Mehetabel, who was confined at home, he said, let us meet and take refuge together in the house of the Most High, and within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, because they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you at night. But I said, should a man like me flee in fear and hide? Should someone like me enter the temple for sanctuary to save his life? I will not go. Then I realized that the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Shai, hath not sent him, and he spoke this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sambalat had hired him, right? So, his spiritual perception, speaking about Nehemiah here, was basically very on point. You know what I'm saying? Because, he understood that, the enemy was coming in with different schemes. They had different plots. They were concocting stories, just like how you see how, when you see, vocab Malone today, you know, um, so-called Hebrew Israelism, and understand that, for them, for the heathens to see us very fervently um striving to please our power, basically dwelling together in unity, putting away all that discord, the bywords, and actually exemplifying true love, actually keeping the commandments, towards one another, that brotherly affection, and so on and so forth. That is a fearful thing in the sight, of these heathens, right? I'm speaking more in today's terms. When they see that brotherly affection, dwelling together in unity without the vexation of Judah and Israel, and so on and so forth, when you think about it from a carnal perspective, that's a very, very fearful thing, especially through the eyes of Esau, because Esau has spent a tremendous amount of time trying to actually sow discord, and enmity between us and our brethren, the different tribes, right? We haven't been together in dwelling together in unity since the days of King Solomon, when you think about it. So that's a very, very long time. So for us to actually have that camaraderie, be able to acknowledge our offenses, and actually be able to come back to an understanding of who we are, and basically put on the new man, basically being refreshed to actually how we're supposed to be, putting away those bywords, the idols, and so on and so forth. It's a very fearful thing in the eyes of these different heathens. They understand the power. They understand the power of when we were actually more closely connected to the Heavenly Father through His Son. The Lord Yahweh Bashem Shai basically would fight for us. This is a very long-standing counsel. When you read the book of Judith, it gives you like an outline of the counsel that the heathens had, because they understood our history going all the way back to our forefather Abraham. And then when our seed, we dwelt in Egypt for a significant amount of time. We were suffering oppression, and we cried unto the Lord. you know they understood that if there was any fault or error, you know with our people, they realized and they understood that our power hates wickedness. They understood that. But if they were on point in terms of doing the things that were pleasing to their power, basically the Lord Yahweh Bashem Shai would fight for us. They understood that. Let me actually read. I'll read maybe like 2 verses of that, just to prove the point. Then I'll come back to the account here. This is Judith 5:18, and it says, "But when they departed from the way that which was appointed which he appointed them, they were destroyed in many battles, very sore, and were led captives into a land which was not theirs, and the temple of their power was cast to the ground, and their cities were taken by their enemies. But now are they returned to their power, and are come up from the places where they were scattered, and have possessed Jerusalem, where their sanctuary is, and are seated in the hill country, was very desolate. For now, therefore, my Lord, um, if and governor, if there be any error against these people, against this people, I'm sorry, and they sinned against their power, let us consider that this shall be their ruin, to let us go up and we shall overcome them. So they're speaking about the Israelites as a people, right? Because this is basically during the time of what's this guy's name? Holophanes. He was a general, and basically he was looking to overtake us as a people. And this there's an individual that's giving basically an account of what's the what's the deal with this, with these people in the hill country. What's their story? Give me the intel. This is the chapter on Israelite intel and how to overcome the Israelites, basically, right? That's what this chapter really is going into, right? And this is before basically Judith actually had stepped in, right? So this is verse 21, and it says, "But if there be no iniquity in their nation, my Lord, let my Lord now pass, lest their Lord defend them, and their God be for them, and we become a reproach before all the world," right? So they have their own stories as well. They have their own accounts of, the things that the Lord did, for us. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you think about when the Lord defended us in the time of like King Hezekiah, yeah, it was Hezekiah. And he was just an example of a righteous king. The Lord came through, basically to his defense and smote the Assyrian army, right? And Sennacherib, he went back, and he faced the judgment of being deleted by his own sons, right? So they knew the power of the Lord and how the Lord would fight for us, right? And that's something that these heathens are very strongly afraid of. So to take the history and understand, why these things are happening, right? The scriptures talk about, as a matter of fact, Paul talks about how the spiritual man judgeth all things, right? So these things that are happening today are not happening for no reason. Let me go here. This is Nehemiah 6, verse 13. And it says here, he was hired for this reason, and I would be affrighted to do as he said to sin. So they would have grounds to make malicious report in order to censor and disgrace me. But my power, Yahweh Bashim Shai, Tobiah and Sanballat, in regards to these actions of theirs, and also remember the prophetess Nodiah and the rest of the prophets who were trying to frighten me. So, it shows you the actions and the carnal schemes that, the heathens did, during this time to try and frighten Nehemiah. So his attention would be taken away, from the rebuilding process, right? And that's basically when you see, folks like Vocab Malone are doing, is to divert our attention away, because basically it's a very fearful thing when we're most closer connected with our power. This is verse 15, and it says the wall is finished. I'm reading in the Amplified, by the way. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And it says, and all Hebrides heard it, and the Gentile nations saw it. They lost all their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our power. I want to read this I want to get this in the NLT. Let me see if I can just pull this up in the NLT real quick. That same chapter. One second. This is verse 16, and it says, when our enemies and the surrounding nations heard it, So when they heard that the wall was completed, they realized they were frightened and humiliated, and they realized they had been helped they had been done with the help of our power, right? So they understood that when the job was done, when the walls were completed, it was through the assistance of our power, Yahweh Bashim Shai, and there was nothing they can do about it, right? So take what happens here in the same sense, because, you know, when people see us in today's terms, you know, it's a I don't want to say it's a fearful thing, but technically it is a fearful thing because we're coming back to understanding who we are as a people. The scriptures say, "He that teacheth the son grieveth the enemy." So we're being taught in the ways, understanding our history and our forefathers, and understanding, and putting away those different abominable practices, right? The scriptures, talk about how after that, those 3 days and a half, because it mentioned the word frightened, you know, in the NLT here. After those 3 days and a half, that this, which is symbolic for that 350 years in Revelation, the 11th chapter, when you had the bulk of the slaves, they came in from, I believe it was Jamestown, Virginia, 1619 to 1620, up until 1969 to 1970, right? You had our elders, Abba Bivens, and basically, that spirit of life, back then began to actually enter into us and began to actually seek the Lord, and seek and get the understanding of who we are as a people, right? That there was when you read in that same chapter, that same precept, there was a great fear that fell upon them that saw them, right? So people would see us and they would marvel, right? Yeah, um that fear was present, what I'm saying, because they will no longer be the Israelites. They will no longer be in a dead state, what I'm saying, because that's what the heathens really want. They just want you, especially Esau wants you Israelites to be constantly in a dead state where you're transgressing, because you're no longer a threat when you behave like that. You're no longer a threat when you're constantly caring about entertainment and dribbling basketballs and caring about BET awards and so on and so forth, right? When you're more in tune with your power, then that's when the heathens start to get nervous, right? Because they know your history, right? Because if they didn't know your history, they wouldn't basically come up with all these different schemish plots to make you transgress. So basically be the accuser of the brethren, right? And that's something that Esau is very good at doing. um just finishing up here, it says, verse 17, moreover, in those days many letters from the nobles of Judah and Tobiah um went from the nobles to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters from them. And it says, from many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, his son Jehohanan, and Mary, the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. And it says, and also they were speaking about Tobiah's good deeds in my presence, and reporting to him what I said. Then Tobiah sent letters to frighten me, right? So, this is going into some of the carnal, schemish plots that were going on, towards, Nehemiah here, right? So when you see these things playing out in today's time, these, because, the scriptures are giving us, yes, Nehemiah is also giving us like insight of what's going on during his time, during that rebuilding process, right? So, we can take the understanding of like also knowing how the enemy is going to move in this time as well, right? Knowing some of the things that they did, right? They said things to frighten him. They sent letters, they tried to make up lies and so on and so forth, try to, concoct stories and things that were not true, right? Because they were basically still in subject to a high, I don't want to say a higher power, but basically the empire, the Medo-Persian Empire at that time as well, right? So, but that's pretty much the point. Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim El Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.